80% of practices you do your assessment with have an issue to be looked into.
Yes.
With intentional theft.
Yeah. In a typical year, we'll have maybe 1 or 2 cases that break $1 million. To answer your question, the biggest one I've seen is around 2 million. Most of the theft that we see is between 2 and 4% of the doctor's revenue. So it's a lot more like a dripping tap in your house than a broken pipe. You need to watch the behavior of the people who you work with, because embezzlers will exude certain types of behavior. For example, a lot of thieves, not all of them, but a lot of thieves are reluctant to take a vacation.
They don't want to leave the operation behind.
When they go, they can't control how information flows, and something may get to the doctor that tells the doctor they have a problem. A lot of thieves are very territorial, so they'll be possessive about their duties. They don't want to offload any of their responsibilities to anybody. They don't even want to cross-train anybody to do any part of their responsibilities. And when we talk about division of duties, that's the control freak, the territorial person is the opposite. I mean, they want to agglomerate duties.
Hello, Rob Lejeune and David Harris here, going to talk about the problem of theft and embezzlement in a dental practice. David, you've been involved in this business for a long time. Why don't we just go back to the beginning, where you got started and why you got started and interested in theft and embezzlement in the dental practice?
I would love to tell you that I saw a business opportunity and I had some master plan and I went at it. That is not what happened at all. I spent some time in the Army, mostly because I got kicked out of high school. I left the Army eventually. I went to work for a bank. I was an investigator there, and it really didn't work out. The bank I worked for just insisted on making the same mistakes over and over. So I quit one day. And I moved back to my hometown, and I'd been there for about 2 weeks. And my phone rang. This was 1989, to give your audience the chronology. My phone rang, and it was the guy I'd been in high school with in my brief stay there, who is now a dentist. And he said to me, "I think my front desk person is stealing from me. And David, I don't have anyone else to call about this." His timing was magnificent. This was the middle of summer of 1989. There was no Netflix, no PVRs, nothing good on TV. I was bored silly. So I said to my friend, "Sure, I'll come to your practice tonight after you close and we'll see what's going on." So that night I went to his practice. This was 1989 BC, in other words, before computers. So in those days, dentists used this old manual system called pegboard. And the amount that each patient owed was kept on what was called a ledger card, which was like 8.5 by 11 heavy cardstock kind of thing. So I got to the practice, and my friend shoved a tray full of these ledger cards at me and said, "Here, it's in here somewhere." And I said to my friend, "We're going to do this a little bit differently. Show me where she works." So he took me to the suspect's work area, and I started going through her desk. And my friend went kind of bug-eyed, like, "Are you going to get me in trouble by this? I mean, am I invading her privacy somehow?" And I told my friend, "Well, no, actually, it's your desk. She just works there. And you're totally entitled to look through it." So what I found, Rob, taped underneath one of the drawers of her desk is what we call in my business the cheat book.
The cheat book. Tell me,
So
what is the cheat book?
The cheat book is where you write down what you've done. So
they're keeping score or keeping record of their activity.
So you don't lose track of what's real and what's fiction. What
the
trips
thief.
up a lot of
about the thief.
I'm talking about the thief. What trips up a lot of thieves is their memory, and they forget something, and they send a bill to somebody who's already paid it, and that person complains to the dentist or something like that.
Okay.
And the cheat book is the way that you stop yourself from doing that. So today you're more likely to see an Excel file on their computer as being their cheat book. But in 1989, it was a notebook. So I found the notebook, and, that gave me the roadmap to see what she had done. And a couple of hours later, I had a pretty clear picture.
How much
And
did that person steal? Can you say, or do you remember?
I remember, yeah, it was about $35,000, which was a lot in 1989. It would
Yeah.
not
It's about
take the
100
same
grand
significance
today.
on today. Um,
Yeah.
but I found that, and my friend was grateful. I mean, he wasn't happy that he'd been stolen from, but he appreciated my work. And he hit me up for one more favor. He said, "Could you please come back in the morning, because I'm going to let her go, and I wouldn't mind having you there." And I thought to myself, well, I'll probably be bored tomorrow too, so of course I'll go. So I came back in the morning. We fired her, which happened very quickly. I mean, she was out the door within about 20 minutes. And my friend promised to buy me dinner that I'll mention I'm still waiting for.
Ha.
And I just kind of shrugged my shoulders and walked away. And I thought it was an interesting activity, but it certainly wasn't beckoning as a career for me.
How much time did it take you to investigate and to figure this thing out for your
Oh,
friend?
it was
You were just
maybe 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Now I had her cheat book, so it's kind of
okay.
like, it's kind of like having the instruction manual for something. It makes putting it together a
Yeah.
whole lot easier, and that was where I was. So I just kind of walked out of this experience, and basically forgot about it
Hmm.
until 2 weeks later. And what happened 2 weeks later was I had an appointment at my own dentist's office. And I
Got
got
it.
there, and I put my hand on the front door, and I was about to go in. You suddenly know how this is going to end. And I looked through the glass panel in the front door, and sitting at his front desk was the same woman I fired 2 weeks ago.
Oh my gosh. She probably went white as a ghost.
She didn't see me.
Okay.
I just looked through the door and saw her. So I turned tail. I sprinted to a payphone, because cell phones in
Yep.
those days were like
Yeah.
the size of a briefcase. And I called the practice, and I used a little bit of deception to get past her and get my doctor on the phone. And when he answered the phone, I told him about the time bomb that was ticking away at his front desk. And I sort of heard him inhale sharply. And he said, "What the hell do I do now?" And about 2 sentences later, he hired me. And by the time that I finished his work, the local Henry Schein rep saw what I was doing, and he had a couple of other clients where he had some concerns. So that's how my business started. Now I did it on my own for quite a while. Eventually I started growing the business. We now have 25 people, and lots of pretty specialized investigators. We have, for example, 2 investigators who only work on orthodontic files, because their business model and their practice management software is very different from a lot of other practices. So we have our own specialists to deal with dental specialists. But the basic things haven't changed. The way that thieves act, and that might be something that we get into in a few minutes. And the basic methods don't change much. I mean, the details certainly evolve over time. And the other thing that doesn't change is the rush that one of my investigators or I get when we see what they're doing and the picture becomes clear.
It's
And I
got to be
certainly,
very rewarding to solve the case for the doctor.
it is. Now, there's a human tragedy behind it as well. I mean, when we
For
solve the
sure.
case, there are going to be several lives and possibly several families that are turned upside down, including the victim and also the thief,
Mm.
and maybe some
Mm.
others. So we never lose sight of that, and um, we are pleased to find theft, but never happy about it.
That's a really good point. It's got to be it's a bittersweet emotion, really, because you're right. There's a reality slap in the face that the doctor gets, which is healthy for him to just understand the reality he's in. And then there's the perpetrator that their life has changed, possibly prison time.
Exactly.
Tell me, what's the single largest case you found, and how many years of embezzlement occurred in such a case?
We've seen embezzlement go on for, I think the longest case I've seen is probably about 12 years, although most of the time we don't end up going back through that full 12 years. In other words, there's a point when you're investigating when you say, okay, I've found enough to give the doctor maximum financial recovery. Continuing to look for more embezzlement is not going to help them. So
Right.
a lot of our investigations get cut off long before we've found every dollar or gone back to day one when it first happened. And that's maybe one of the myths about this business. It's not normally essential that we find every dollar. What we need to find is enough so that you can get back all the money that you can get back.
For sure. And I know you've had cases like over $1 million in some cases.
Yeah, we have, in a typical year, we'll have maybe one or two cases that break $1 million. To answer your question, the biggest one I've seen is around 2 million.
Wow. And is that the one that lasted 12 years?
No, that one went on 6.5 years roughly. So this
probably
is somebody taking
higher revenue,
$300,000 a year.
Yeah, I would imagine like a higher revenue, like surgical practice, because there's a P&L that occurs, right? Like the profit and loss statement. And if the doctor's profitable and the practice seems to be running okay, then there's a perception that maybe we're not as profitable as we should be. And then it goes undetected because they're profitable. Is that kind of what you see? There's this false sense of success when the P&L says things are okay. So you're paying your bills and it just continues to go undetected.
That's well put. And the one I mentioned of $2 million over 6.5 years, that's an extreme example. That's a real outlier in this world. Most of the theft that we see is between 2 and 4% of the doctor's revenue. So it's a lot more like a dripping tap in your house than a broken pipe.
The leaky barrel syndrome.
Yeah, it's not going to fill your basement quickly with water.
And maybe do the smart thieves know this, and they know they can only take so much to remain undetected? Is that maybe a part of the strategy in their cheat book?
It can be, and not every thief sets out to steal every conceivable dollar from the doctor. Thieves have different motivations. Some people steal because they're kind of backed into a corner financially and they're trying not to lose their house. And if that's me, then I'm probably stealing just enough to keep the wolves from my door. And I feel bad about it. I just don't think I have any choice. And then you've got the other thieves, the greedy ones or the egotistical ones, and they kind of have this feeling that society's not rewarding them properly, and they'll be capable of being a lot more aggressive. So not every thief is trying to shear the sheep right to the skin. But yeah, to answer your question, yes, they are usually pretty good at assessing what the doctor's pain point is for theft and then staying below it.
Yeah, because if the practice is profitable, then that's a good thing, right? If the practice starts losing money, then that's when natural alarm bells will sound in any business that we should start looking at our expenses and where's the money going? I mean, any good entrepreneur would ask those questions, even if there is no thievery, because you need to be profitable.
Yeah, very true. And one thing that not everybody realizes is that most theft in dentistry happens on the revenue side. In other words, from patient payments or insurance payments, and what I call expense side theft, which might be things like payroll or maybe tampering with accounts payable. Those things happen too. but they're far less prevalent than stealing revenue.
What's an example? Can you share, like, when you say revenue side theft, I'm not sure I
I'm talking
understand what
about
that means.
picking patient payments or insurance payments.
Personally, like cash payments, just stealing that, or what do you,
Yeah.
what?
Cash is every thief's first choice, Rob, but it's not their only choice.
Right.
Yourself.
So, okay, so revenue side theft. So then what does a doctor do to reconcile revenue to make sure that the money's flowing into his account as it should be?
There are really three main things that a doctor should do. The first thing is that practice management software at the end of each day can generate a day end report. It's sometimes called a day sheet in different software, but there's a report that recaps what happened today. And the first thing is that, and this is a general rule, any report that a doctor relies on to do financial integrity checking needs to be one that she printed herself.
The doctor needs to print
The
it
doctor.
themselves.
When
Yes.
you allow somebody to hand you a report, you have opened the door to selective reporting.
Good point.
So print the day end report yourself. After you print it, the next thing to belabor the obvious is then you need to look at it. And I tell doctors to look at two things on their day end report. The first question is, does it line up with my memory? In other words, if I'm looking at a patient on the report and I see a 2-surface filling, but I remember that was a big 4-surface, that's not right. So I've got to compare what the day sheet said happened against what I remember is happening. And one of the truisms here is if you don't do that, if you don't stop the garbage in, garbage out problem, then every other piece of scrutiny you do after that is pointless because it's being done on the wrong premise. The second question to ask is, does it make sense? So let's say that I'm looking at my hygienist, their work on the day end report, and the hygienist saw 12 patients today. And my policy is that patients get annual x-rays. So making some allowance for maybe pedo patients and perio patients, there should be around 4 to 6 sets of film today. And, if I looked at today and I saw 3, that doesn't mean anything's wrong. But if I look at the whole week and on average, there's 3 sets of x-rays a day, something's gone wrong. And maybe it's the hygienist who has decided that x-rays aren't important, or maybe they're being taken and not being billed for some reason.
So it could be negligence, right? Or
it could be a lot of things, but what it is costing you money.
Exactly.
So step one is print your day sheet and look at it. And look at it today. If you throw that day sheet in a pile and you get to it the day after tomorrow, you don't remember enough about what happened today to make that review meaningful. It's got to be contemporaneous. The second thing, and this is not taught anywhere, and I don't know why. The second thing we tell doctors to do is a little calculation called articulation.
Okay.
And I'm borrowing a word from their vocabulary very deliberately because when they hear articulation, they think of
I was thinking the same thing.
Mandible and maxilla and how they should fit together. Well, I'm talking about things fitting together in a financial sense. What articulation involves is this. You take all those day end reports that you printed and reviewed from the month, once the month is over. You add up the totals of the 3 numbers at the bottom, which are fees, adjustments, and payments across them. So if your practice was open 15 days last month, you should have 15 totals for fees, adjustments, and payments. You add them up and you compare them to a month-end report that you print. And the day-end reports total should be to the penny exactly what the month-end report is. If that's not the case, Rob, somebody came in after hours and they did some stuff they didn't want you to see. So what articulation does, to express it a little bit differently, is it makes sure that everything that happened this month is on one of those 15 or whatever reports that you reviewed, and nothing has squirted by you.
No leaks in revenue, basically.
Well, no hidden transactions, because if I'm stealing from you, one of the things that will give me a huge advantage is if I can enter transactions into your software that you don't know are there. And if you don't look at your day sheets at all, which probably describes 20% of the dentists I run into, then it's simple. If you look at your day sheets, now I have to figure out another way to keep things out of your view plane. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to do some after hours stuff and not give it to you. So
Wow.
articulation is the way that we prevent that. And then the third thing that has to happen is, now that you've compared daily and against monthly and they line up, now take your monthly report and compare how much it said you collected with how much went in your bank. They will probably not be exactly the same.
Yeah, because timing and of payment and deposits.
Yeah,
But
exactly. If a patient pays by credit card on the last day of the month, it will be treated as a collection for software this month, but it won't hit your bank till next month. The only thing about those timing differences is they self-correct. So let's say in the last day of this month, a patient makes a big payment. It's $4,000 and they pay by credit card, and it gets captured in your software this month, but it doesn't get deposited at your bank until next month. So if that was the only timing difference for the month, then what you're going to see is that your practice management software collections exceed your bank deposits by $4,000. But next month, you're going to start with a $4,000 deposit in the bank that has no offset in practice management software because the other side of it happened in the previous month. So if that's the only timing difference next month, then you're going to see bank greater than practice management software by $4,000. What I tell people to do is take the variances and plot them on a graph. So at the end of each month, we see what the difference is between practice management software and collections, and we stick it on a graph. And if what you're seeing is timing, if what you're seeing is caused by timing, then the graph is going to look kind of roughly like a sine wave. If it's something else, then you won't see a sine wave kind of pattern. You'll see maybe an escalating variance.
yeah, it'll so monthly, quarterly, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, you'll see it'll go up and down. And obviously if sales are going up, then it might adjust relative to sales, but you're not going to see this sort of like linear escalating, variance over time.
And your collections would have to be going up very dramatically to really create a bias that way. Most of the time, again, what you should see is that in some months collections, according to bank, exceed or deposits at the bank exceed collections in practice management software, and in other months you'll see the reverse. So you should see a kind of scatter of some variances in each direction. And if you're looking at 6 months and practice management software exceeded bank deposits for all of those 6 months, that's not timing.
Yeah,
there's something else going on there, and embezzlement is a viable possibility.
Yeah, looking at cash deposits relative to sales over time, that's
It's not just cash, and dentists make that mistake a lot. The only thing they can conceive of somebody stealing is $20 bills.
Right.
And if I'm a thief, cash is definitely my first choice. But one thing that's changed how thieves think is that the amount of cash that practices collect has been in long-term decline.
Sure.
When I started in this world, a lot of practices took in 10 or 12% of their revenue in cash. Now with most practices, it's under 2%. We see a lot of practices where cash collections are under 1%. So what that means to a thief is there's not enough cash coming in for me to scratch my itch with cash only. And I have to diversify. So I need to find a way to steal checks.
Gotcha. Okay. Talk about if a doctor says, well, I have a really good accounting team and I trust them. Sometimes the accounting team is just reporting on numbers given to them, and they're not really going to take the onus of this forensic investigation type stuff that you do. Like, what could a doctor ask of his accounting team to at least give him some of this stuff that you're talking about?
It's not likely to happen. And this is one of the things that a lot of doctors misunderstand. You know, they think that if embezzlement was happening, their CPA would find it.
Right.
And that's categorically not the case. And the numbers back that up. When we look at all businesses, so dentistry, but also everything else, around 40% of employee theft is found by the accounting profession. When we narrow the focus to dentistry, that number drops to about 6%.
Really? That's shocking.
Well, let's talk about why. What differentiates dentistry from most businesses is that there are two pieces of accounting software used simultaneously. In other words, practices typically use practice management software to record revenue, and they use QuickBooks or Sage or some kind of accounting software to keep track of their expenses. These two softwares don't talk to each other. And when accountants do your work, most practices are on what's called the cash method of accounting for tax purposes. And what that means is that the measurement process starts when cash hits your bank. In other words, doing work on a patient or sending a bill to an insurance company doesn't create an event that is captured by your accounting process. It is not until the money goes in the bank that you become taxable on it. So what that means for the accounting profession is they do not need to look at your practice management software.
They just look at deposits.
What happens in that software is typically a black box. Their work starts when money hits the bank. Theft typically happens before money hits the bank. So it's outside of the periscope that the accountant has to look at the business.
I mean, after you've done your work in a practice, do you have accounting firms that you recommend that like do a better job at looking at practice management data to keep things up to snuff?
I know very few accountants who have the expertise to do that.
Okay.
And I don't think it's their job. And I also don't think a lot of dentists want to pay them for that. No, the accountants are not your first line of defense here. The first line of defense for a practice owner is getting inside their practice management software a little bit. And the number of doctors who we see, Rob, who don't even know their password to their practice management software is staggering. And thankfully, we see some other examples as well of people who are very comfortable in their software. But what I tell a lot of dentists is that software is more important to your financial well-being than your handpieces.
Interesting.
And every dentist knows their handpiece like it's their other child. But when it comes to the software, I might break something. It's not going away. I mean, we're not going to all come into work on January 1st and practice management software has vanished from the planet and it's not coming back.
Of course.
It's going to be with every dentist who listens to this for the rest of their career. And the best advice I can give you is let's just acknowledge that and commit to the effort needed to understand your software. And not just for embezzlement. I mean, there's a whole lot of information in there that will help you run a better practice.
Absolutely. Let's talk about, there's a super common theme of just putting too much trust into one person, right? If one human has too much access to the software and the reporting, and if you're relying on all your data on one person, that's a very common problem that can occur. And then talk about the importance of maybe separation of duties and holding different people accountable for different things that are kind of siloed out as a really good best practice for protection.
It absolutely is. And let's be mindful that every act of theft involves two components. There's stealing and concealing. And when danger happens is when the same person has the opportunity to both steal and conceal. And the point of division of duties, which you just mentioned, and that's something I'm very big on. The point of dividing up duties is to make it so that if I want to steal from my doctor, I have to go to a coworker and ask for their. And that barrier will stop a whole lot of people. It's a very risky conversation, so it will stop a whole lot of people from even trying. And I can remember one case we were involved in where these two people worked side by side in a practice, and neither of them was stealing. 2 years later, they'd both moved on and they were working in different practices from each other, and they were both stealing.
Wow.
So you have to assume that 2 years ago, when they were working side by side, they probably each had thoughts about stealing from that practice, but neither of them was prepared to approach the other and say, let's do this together. So division of duties is key. And I see a lot of literature that says to doctors, you need to divide up duties in your practice, but it kind of ends there, and they don't give any rules or guidance as to how to do it. So I'm gonna go a whole lot further here. In terms of dividing up duties, let's talk about what the duties are. And in a practice's revenue cycle, there are basically 6 things that happen. Somebody records treatment in practice management software. Then bills get sent to patients and insurance companies. Then hopefully payments get made. Those payments get recorded in software. At the end of the day, there's a balancing activity that happens, and then the money gets deposited. So again, we've got treatment entered, bills sent, payments received, payments recorded, the day balanced and depositing. Those are the 6 tasks that happen. And what I'm going to give your audience is 3 rules. The first rule is the only people who should be entering treatment into your software are clinicians who are in the room when it was done. So if I'm a dentist, my assistant is normally, one of their jobs is to enter into practice management software what I did or what I'm doing on the patient who's in the chair right now. In a hygiene operatory, this is normally done by the hygienist. The old-fashioned way of, back when computers first came into practices, typically there was one terminal and it was at the front desk. So in those days, clinicians couldn't enter treatment and they had to communicate somehow to the front desk who would enter it. And lots of things can go wrong there. Theft isn't the only one. Can't read somebody's handwriting would be a problem. But entering treatment in the clinical area makes it harder to steal. Because what that means is that a patient standing at the front desk already owes the practice money. And whatever theft happens has to deal with that existing balance. On the other hand, if treatment is entered by the front desk, then the patient arrives at the front desk with a 0 balance. And the front desk has a little more control over how much that patient will owe according to the practice management software. So rule number 1, treatment entered by clinician. We've got 5 jobs left. Patients and insurance companies are billed, payments are received, they're recorded, they're reconciled at the end of the day, and they're deposited. And I'm going to give the audience 2 rules for those 5 things. Okay. The first rule is nobody should do more than 2 of those jobs. And the second rule is the 2 that they do should not be sequential. So the person who does balancing at the end of the day does not make the deposit. The person who receives payments doesn't record them. And
how many, sorry, keep going.
If you have a big practice, this is easy. If you have 5 front desk staff and an office manager, no problem to divide up the jobs in the way that I'm suggesting. If you go back to that small 1 doctor, 1 hygienist, 1 assistant, 1 receptionist practice, it's a little more challenging. And there, what might happen, for example, is maybe that part of your assistant's job is to do the balancing at the end of the day. Probably there are some things the doctor has to do personally, like an easy one is get the mail. And I don't mean have mail come to the front desk and somebody put it on your desk. I mean, have a post office box that you have the key to, and you're the person who picks up the mail and opens it.
Because the the mail coming into the practice is also a source of things going awry. Someone grabs something out of the mail and then never gives it to the doctor.
Well, like I said, receiving payments is one of those 6 tasks.
Right.
And we want that to be in different hands than the person who records the payment.
So with those 6 tasks, how many people could it be? Could it be 3 people? Like what is typically your recommendation in a decent sized practice?
Well, the minimum is 3.
Okay.
The maximum could be higher because you've got clinicians entering the treatment. So let's call it one person, although it might be multiple clinicians. It's one role. And then you've got bill, receive, record, balance, deposit. And nobody can do more than 2 of those. So you've got 5 tasks. You need 3 people to cover those 5 tasks, although one of the people could be the clinicians who are entering the treatment as well. So 3 is the minimum.
Got it. And if a doctor is, paranoid for a healthy reason, they might think, well, I just need to do everything myself, but they're also a clinician, right? So they do need people to trust to a certain degree. Obviously, you want to verify things, but also they need to be chairside with patients and focusing on their practice. Speak to the perception that a doctor might think, I need to do everything myself, and then they kind of swing the pendulum over to now they're not being a clinician, they're trying to do all these other things, and they're really going to hurt their ability to grow the practice.
What I'm going to say is that with business ownership, whether it's a dental practice or a corner store, with business ownership comes responsibility. And if you don't want that responsibility, that's fine, but you shouldn't be a practice owner. Unfortunately, I think to a lot of dentists, practice ownership is kind of presented as the dental version of the American dream. So you go to dental school, you graduate, you associate for a couple of years, and you build up your hand speed, and then the next thing that everybody does is buy a practice. And some subset of the dental population just isn't really equipped for that. And a lot of the people who we see in a huge amount of angst at some point got there because, their desire was to be pure clinicians. And when somebody exploitively said to them, doctor, you just go in that operatory and do great dentistry and I'll look after everything else, things went wrong. So if you want to be a practice owner, with that comes responsibility. If you don't want that responsibility, the good news is there are lots and lots of great career paths that you can follow in dentistry that don't require you to act like a business owner. I mean, you can become an instructor at a dental school. You can work for a DSO or a FQHC. You can put on a uniform and serve your country. You can go work at an insurance company reviewing claims. I mean, there are lots of career options open to dentists who don't want the responsibility of ownership, but you can't have it both ways. So
that's a good point. And I do think that's maybe one of the ingredients to the rise of DSO dentistry is doctors want to just be clinicians and let someone else manage the business. Have you seen embezzlement happen on a larger scale inside of a DSO?
It happens with astonishing frequency in DSOs. And we work for some of the biggest DSOs in the country, and we also work for solo practices, and we really cover the whole continuum. One of the things that hurts DSOs is that every thief has to rationalize what they're doing. So we all learned when we were 3 years old that you don't take other people's stuff.
Right.
And what every thief has to do, Rob, is say to themselves, I know that in general stealing is wrong, but it's okay in this case because. And then whatever comes out of their mouth after the because is the rationalization. It is much easier to rationalize stealing from a great big monolithic entity.
It's not personal.
From the dentist you work 20 feet away from all day, who signed your paychecks and gave you a pay advance 2 months ago when you were in a jam financially. The second thing that hurts DSOs sometimes is overconfidence. Some of them suffer from the "we are big, therefore we must be smart" fallacy. And it's there are some complexities in running a DSO that solo practitioners don't have. And one of the things in DSOs is that often the further up the food chain you get, the less that people understand about dentistry.
That's a really good point. And back to your two things, stealing and concealing, and with the complexity of a DSO, does that complexity provide cover for concealment? Maybe it's kind of what
It absolutely does. And I was talking to a DSO a little while ago. So a lot of DSOs have somebody called a regional manager, and the regional managers typically used to be office managers, and now they're supervising roughly 8 practices, and that number varies a little bit from DSO to DSO. Depending on how those 8 practices got there, it's entirely possible that they're using 4 different practice management softwares among those 8 practices. So you have somebody who's responsible for what happens in those 8 practices, and three of them may use some software they've never seen before and don't really know their way around. It's a tough job. And then you have other complexities. A lot of DSOs, when they affiliate with a doctor, will buy the non-clinical part of their practice. And one of the ways they pay for that is something called an earnout. So an earnout is a transaction based on future earnings. And we have seen more than a handful of cases of doctors who sell their practice to a DSO, and then they have some kind of earnout cooking the books so that they get paid out more in that earnout.
So the actual doctor is the thief, overstating performance and revenue through, obviously the six areas you outlined is where the doctor's gonna.
We won't get into details, but
sure,
an earnout is a formula, and it's a formula that has some artificialities, like the periods that we're going to look at for the earnout, and people play games with it.
Obviously, I can see that for sure. So, what are some recommendations you make to DSOs? They're big, therefore they must be smart. My guess is you have to kind of approach them a little bit differently than you would a solo practitioner, right? What are the common things you recommend or that you look into with them to make sure they're secure?
They need enterprise-wide consistent systems, and a lot of DSOs grow by acquisition. So they affiliate with practices. Others do what the DSOs call de novo, which means startups.
Right.
When they grow by acquisition, what happens next is they take over practices that have existing systems. And a lot of the DSOs just leave whatever's in place.
They don't want to disrupt revenue and disrupt operations.
It's hard to find good staff, and they don't want to create waves, and they don't want to be heavy-handed and say, no, now that you're part of our DSO, you're going to do it our way. So they tend to have this laissez-faire approach in a lot of cases to the offices that they affiliate with. And there are 2 problems with that. The systems may not have been all that good in the first place. And secondly, the driver just stepped off the bus while the bus is still moving. In other words, the dentist who used to enforce those systems is now saying to themselves, well, the whole reason I affiliated with the DSO was I want to be a clinician, not a business owner. So I'm done with this. Running the place is now their problem. So those 2 things kind of happen simultaneously. And, it also leaves the DSO with this patchwork of systems and maybe a whole bunch of different practice management softwares and so on. There's no right answer here, but, I like to see DSOs have standards for things like day-end balancing. And I was having a conversation a little while ago with the CEO and the chief financial officer of a DSO that owned about 100 practices. So they're fair sized. And I was asking them about day-end balancing in their practices. And these 2 guys were looking at each other saying, like, do we do that? I wonder how many of our offices do that. They had no idea. And that is such a basic building block in a control system. So clearly they did not have an enterprise-wide policy that says, at the end of the day, before you go home, office manager, here's what you have to do.
Submit a report. You have 100 offices, maybe they have 5 different systems, but what you're speaking to is a behavior that's people are held accountable to, even though they have disparate systems. They can all submit a day in balance upstream to begin that process.
Yeah, I mean, you can roll out systems as far as you want, and you can have a system where everybody answers the phone in a consistent way. Whether you do that or not is not something I have an opinion on. But in terms of financial controls, yes, the more homogeneous the operation of different offices is, the easier it is for regional management and top management to keep control of the operation. Even as you say, if you're submitting a report to head office, everybody should be submitting the same template.
Right.
And not, you have 3 offices who submit this one and 7 who submit that one and 5 more who don't submit anything.
It's an obvious point, right? Having a monolithic system is going to be easier for, auditing and accountability, but having disparate systems, provides a cover of that confusion, and then concealment will be easier for thieves.
Sure it does. And let's talk about the elephant in the room. For a lot of DSOs, the past 3 to 5 years have presented significant buying opportunities. I mean, you have the baby boomers who are exiting the profession. At the same time, you had really low interest rates because DSOs depend on borrowing and leverage. So it was a great climate for acquiring practices, and that became their focus. And now with interest rates having climbed a little bit and, possibly a lot of that baby boomer demographic bubble having already turned their practices over, now it's not quite as much of a target rich environment. And a lot of the DSOs are now sort of turning internally a little bit more and saying, all right, what control weaknesses do we have and how do we address them? But there was a time when growth was everything everybody talked about. And if you go to a DSO conference now, words you're going to hear a whole lot are same store sales. In other words, with this pool of resources, patient base and equipment and team, how do we maximize the amount of money that we get out of that resource pool? And obviously, sewing up a hole in your pocket is one way of improving same store sales.
For sure. It makes total sense. But I can see, I went through an acquisition. My company was acquired, and the purchaser of the company elected short term not to change any of the systems, because changing systems is a big disruption to business, for sure, short term. But yet, over time, we were brought into a monolithic system. And so there should be a plan or a time horizon of, hey, over the next, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, we're going to move this practice into this system for greater accountability and efficiency and all those types of things.
Exactly. And unfortunately, in an acquisition-friendly environment, I think a lot of people forget about that part because the rainbow they're chasing is really the next practice or the next group of practices they want to buy.
Yeah, for sure.
And when that slows down, as it has for a lot of DSOs now, it's a great time to get a little more introspective and to say, all right, what do we need to do now that we've acquired some great practices to make sure that we're getting out of them what we should?
For sure. So if I'm let's say I'm a solo practitioner, been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years, and I think whether I think there's thievery occurring or whether I think maybe my books are a little messy, and I want to engage with your company, David, to do an assessment. Like, what does that look like? What does that cost? How much time does that take to engage with you, just to do an assessment of my business, maybe a brief audit, or what do you call it? I mean, how does someone engage with you just to do a temperature check of their condition?
Temperature checks are a little problematic here. on a whole bunch of levels. Normally when somebody has enough concern to call us, we want to do it properly.
Okay.
And
So what does that look like?
well, let's talk about that. I'll mention first of all that we offer two products, and they're very different. We do what we call audits or investigations, and that's where we're looking backwards into what happened in the past. And it's kind of transaction focused. In other words, a lot of that work typically is that we make a copy of somebody's practice management software so we can look at it inconspicuously and offline. And then we go through it and we look for the inconsistencies that would be there if somebody was stealing.
Okay.
We also do proactive work, and proactive work involves working with a practice owner on their systems. And systems here is everything from what kind of pre-employment screening they do before they hire people, to security settings in their practice management software, to how they divide up duties, as we talked about earlier, to what sort of day end and month end review does the practice owner do. So that's our proactive package. Our investigation work, as I say, we stealthily, because this is all designed so staff don't know what's going on. We stealthily look backward, maybe for a year, but maybe at some other period, and we see what's going on in the software and whether there's money missing, and if there is, then who did it, and let's put together a report that outlines what happened so the doctor can get some money back on their insurance.
And have you ever had a situation where you found money missing, but it wasn't theft, it was just negligence?
Oh, we see that quite a bit. One of the examples of this is something that we call Robin Hood theft. And, Robin Hood, of course, being the medieval character who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. So I'm working in a practice, and I really despise asking patients for money. And I have this deep set feeling that I can't shake, that their insurance should cover 100% of their dental care. Right. So you're in as a patient, and, at the end of your treatment, there's $300 that your insurance didn't cover. And I don't want to ask you for it, so I write it off.
Don't even try.
It's not embezzlement. It doesn't put money in my pocket.
But it's not money into the practice pocket.
But it costs the doctor exactly the same amount as if you paid that $300 and I stole it.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
So we see that with some regularity. And, initially the symptoms are the same to the doctor. I mean, I'm working hard and I don't have as much money in my account as I feel like I should. Can you guys please figure out why? And sometimes the answer is, yeah, the thieves aren't stealing your money. They're just giving it away instead.
They don't have the guts to hold the patient accountable and to, give them the reality that there is a fee to pay, and they'll write it off with little or no attempt to collect.
I mean, some staff really hate the money conversation with patients. Some staff kind of over empathize with the patients and think that dentistry is really expensive and there's no way these people can afford it. And I don't feel right asking them for money that I think they shouldn't have to pay in the first place. I mean, there are lots of motivations for this, but again, it costs the doctor exactly as much money as if the staff member stole it.
That was going to be my question. Like Robin Hood theft, does it add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars? Like, have you seen like that amount be reached?
Absolutely. Yeah, if somebody does this over an extended period of time, and the typical thief will not write off all copays, but they'll target some, and if somebody's doing $40,000 or $50,000 of copays a year, and they do that for 4 years, yeah, you're into some pretty serious dollars.
Are there like benchmarks of copay write-offs that you look at industry-wide to give a doctor a frame of reference of what would be normal?
That's really tough. You have so many different practice configurations. You have fee-for-service practices. You have practices that accept insurance but aren't in network. You have PPO practices. You have practices that follow all of these activities at some level. So they're in network with 3 providers and they're out of network with others. And, urban and rural practices tend to behave a little bit differently. Like there are a lot of variables, and I'd really be nervous about trying to come up with a number and say, on average, your adjustment should be 12% of your gross collections. I think I think if you do that, you're going to point people in wrong directions.
Good point. I mean, it's
We
relative to
don't,
their situation.
yeah, we don't keep those yardsticks. Now, it's easy to look at a trend line for the same practice over time.
Mm.
And we do that sometimes, but even there, you get structural factors that change.
Yeah, like if
A practice drops one insurance company, for example.
okay, or if write-offs increased in accordance with we hired a new front office lady, right? I mean, maybe there's a pattern there relative to people. You ever seen that?
There may be. We tend to solve the embezzlement question by looking at individual transactions and not trends. In other words, if you said to me, well, David, I'm calling you because, over the last 5 years, my office collected
There, David. I think I may
2% of
have
its
lost
revenue
you.
in cash. And over the last 9 months, that number's dropped to 1.4%. I'm wondering what's going on. If somebody said that to me, I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, well, of course it must be embezzlement. I would say to myself, all right, what other structural factors are at play here? Do we have somebody who, do we have an area where there's a whole lot of in-migration of immigrants? Because one thing with immigrants is they tend to pay in cash. So, is the practice demographic changing? Is there something else going on that caused this decline? And the way we find that answer is we open up the practice management software and we see what's inside.
So I'm hearing over and over that the guts of the truth is in practice management software, and then a reconciliation to what goes in the bank.
The reconciliation is vital, because if you don't do that, you have made stealing so easy. In other words, if I can record payments in software and not deposit the money,
Right.
that's what I'm going to do. And the dumbest, laziest thief on the planet can pull that one off.
Yeah.
If there is somebody above me doing that comparison, I can still steal, but the way I have to do it now is I have to make the software lie about how much money came in, and that's much more challenging. So as soon as you check collections against deposits, instantly you knock out the bottom quartile of thieves. They just can't figure out how to steal from you. There are others who can, but that's easy. If you don't reconcile, it's kind of like leaving your car unlocked with your laptop in the back seat. I mean, there's there's an open invitation to an easy theft there.
And that's all, revenue side theft. On expense side theft, is that harder to detect as a category?
It depends, and we don't see a lot of expense side theft. And the reason, Rob, is that in most practices, the expenses are much more centralized at the doctor. In other words, typically the doctor is the only person who has the checkbook and signs checks. Typically the bank statement comes in and is seen by the doctor. And the expenses are the one place where you have accounting oversight, because, the accountant has to look at the practice expenses and say, are these really business expenses, or are they personal expenses that should be put to the doctor's drawing account, and so on. So the expense side tends to be much better controlled in most practices than revenue.
Interesting.
And you have a smaller group who are involved on the expense side. And again, I'm not suggesting that expense side theft doesn't happen. Categorically, it does. But
yeah, I mean,
it's less likely, and there are less people involved.
stealing a paperclip is where it starts, but then expensing personal items on the doctor's account that go undetected. And that could be small things or could be, bigger things. I actually once had an employee put a engagement ring on a company credit card. And I found it, and obviously I confronted him, and I just thought it baffled me that he would do that. But it does happen, and so the classic things of watching your expenses and auditing them, and if you're empowering someone to buy stuff for your practice with some type of online account, sure.
A lot of doctors suffer from not being able to differentiate delegation from abdication.
Tell me more.
Delegation means I'm giving you a job to do. I'm going to hold you accountable, and not in a theoretical sense, but in a real sense. And I'm going to acquire whatever knowledge I need to. In other words, I'm going to devote the mental energy to this process so that I understand what you're doing well enough to have a real accountability. So if we entrust an employee to purchase stuff on some kind of account for the practice, then accountability means I review that, or maybe somebody external like the bookkeeper reviews that stuff and tries to flag things that aren't right. Abdication means, here, I'm giving you the credit card and I'm never going to look at the statements for it. So just buy what the hell you want. And the second part of that isn't verbalized, but that's kind of what the stealing employee hears. So a lot of dentists abdicate things when they really need to delegate.
Yeah, this is where the classic trust but verify comes into play, right? I mean, when you verify someone's transactions, they might feel like, what? Do you not trust me, doctor? But it should be a simple conversation of, yes, I trust you, but I'm going to verify all transactions in my practice just to be a good business owner.
One of my investigators, who's very good at her job, and her name is Amber Weber Gonzalez, and I'll give her a shout out right now. One of the things Amber said to me years ago that has always stuck with me is she said, one of the first casualties of embezzlement is transparency.
Interesting.
So if I'm stealing from you, I will actively resent any kind of oversight. And of course, I don't want to show you reports or anything like that of what I'm doing. And that was kind of profound, and it always stuck with me after she said that. And I think you more or less said the same thing.
Yeah, if the employee isn't totally like, for sure, I'll give you full transparency, right? Like if they're good-hearted, they'll understand the logic behind being verified, right?
The other thing about trust that I find interesting is the way that human nature and trust collide. So what we do as humans is, when you first meet somebody, probably within the first 5 minutes, you're assessing that person and you're thinking to yourself, can I trust them? And if your answer to that is yes, then you kind of lock that in a closet somewhere and you never, ever revisit it. And I say to dentists now, trust is a little more dynamic concept than that. Somebody who was trustworthy 5 years ago might be going through a divorce now and might be trying to adapt to the economics of 2 incomes in 2 households instead of 2 incomes in 1 household. And maybe they're 2 months behind in the mortgage payment. And maybe the fact that they were trustworthy 5 years ago isn't really germane anymore.
Really good point. Trust is dynamic, but I see your point.
As humans, you only want to solve this problem once. You don't want to keep facing it over and over.
Yeah, there's a weird feeling you have as a human when you say, I don't know if I can trust this person.
Yeah.
Right? Because then now that makes me vulnerable. Now, what do I do about that? And all these other emotions come into play. But if you're verifying it along the way, then you actually are informing your trust. You can say, I trust them because I have systems in place and I know I can trust them.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That's the best way to do it. Unfortunately, that's just not human nature. When we meet people, we size them up, and again, pretty quickly we decide are they meritors of my trust or not? And if they aren't, then it's exactly what you say. That instantly makes the relationship adversarial. I mean, as soon as I think that you're trying to steal my wallet, the way I behave with you is different. So life's a whole lot easier when we can trust people. But the fact that I trusted you 5 years ago doesn't mean that today you are as worthy of that trust as you were 5 years ago. And that's the problem that we as humans have. We just don't want to reopen this once we've made our initial assessment.
Right, because a thief might justify with new life difficulty that they're going through, right? A child's in the hospital, or family has cancer, or whatever, tragic things for sure.
Or I've developed a gambling habit since you first met
me. that actually, this is a true story. The guy who was stealing from my grandfather, he pulled up into work with a brand new blue Corvette that he paid cash for because he won $50,000 in Vegas. And he told everyone, I won 50 grand at the craps table. And my dad, being older and wiser, said, Rob, if someone has the ability to win 50 grand, that means they have the ability to lose 50 grand. And anybody in their right mind, once you're up like a couple $1,000s, you'd walk away from the table. To go up $50,000 means you have a desensitivity. Anyways, he was stealing. He stole over $400,000 and he was using it to gamble. So, interesting side story. So, David, so you'll come in, you'll do an assessment. I'm sure the fees relative to the size and scope of the project. Do you have an ongoing engagement, right? So I'm sure there's this bigger expense to kind of like do this initial scope of work. And then do you do like annual audits to make sure things are up to snuff? Like what does that look like long term with your company and how you help practices?
Let me start by answering a question you asked before and I didn't answer, and that was about fees. You're absolutely right. There are some variables that determine what an investigation will cost. The rough guideline I'll give your readers or your audience is for us to look at 1 year in a one doctor $1 million practice is normally about $8,000.
1 year, one doctor, 1 million, 8,000.
Around 8,000. A 4-doctor oral surgery practice might be closer to $20,000. We discourage annual audits, or what we refer to as audits on a schedule. What I'd much rather do is teach you as a practice owner how to self-monitor and recognize when you have a problem and then call us back. And to me, that's a much better use of your time and money than having us come in every year, whether you have any symptoms of embezzlement or not.
David, I love that answer. So your goal is to teach, so do this forensic analysis, find what you need to find, and then teach the doctor how to not need you in the future.
Well, what I want to do is make the doctor into a smoke alarm, because I'm the fire department.
Yes, very good analogy.
So I don't think we will ever teach ourselves into obsolescence. But what I want doctors to do is to get good at recognizing the things they might see if embezzlement was happening, and then call us. And, the thought of our coming back every year, I think, would also foster some laziness. Again, I'll mention there are those doctors who want to be pure clinicians. And, at some level, they're prepared to probably throw a little bit of money at us so they don't really have to put any systems in place. And I'm just philosophically opposed to that approach. So we discourage the, audit us every year, every 3 years or whatever. We encourage, let's talk about how to recognize that you might have a problem, and then call us. And, we'll be there in 48 hours.
So let's say I'm a doctor and I do want to be mostly a clinician and hands-off. Can I have you just train my staff and train my accounting team and build systems that will work for me as the doctor? So I'm not having to like do that much myself, or how does that work?
That doesn't work. We
Okay.
this ship needs a captain.
Okay.
It cannot it cannot sail itself, and you have to be that captain. And as I say, if you don't want to be the captain of the ship, then sell to a DSO or find another career path. Assuming you say no, I want to keep the ship, then you have some responsibility. One of the problems is that, most doctors' control systems are kind of self-developed, and they're not particularly efficient, at least in this way. The time commitment that, if you ask me, what's my time commitment as a practice owner to financial oversight, I would say 10 minutes a day and an hour to an hour and a half once a month.
That sounds painless.
It's not totally painless, but again, if you don't want that, if you're hearing me say that and your response is, oh gosh, that's too much, that's gonna cramp my lifestyle somehow, then I think what you just said to yourself is, I'm not really temperamentally suited to be a practice owner.
What if the doctor is married with a wife who is financially savvy? Could you train her how to be the financial captain of the ship? And I've had scenarios like that where there's a captain that's highly trustworthy. Hopefully, if they've been married, they trust each other, right? Where the doctor can really just focus on the practice.
If you have that luxury, that's a great place to be. And I have no objection to that. The only thing I will mention, Rob, is that roughly half of all marriages end in a divorce.
We know this.
And
sad.
we have a fair number of cases where the situation is as you described, the dentist's husband is running the finances of the practice. And let's say the husband decides that they're going to trade the dentist in for a newer model. They know that when that happens, they're going to, their paycheck is going to stop.
So they need to save up.
Yeah, let me put some money under the mattress before I drop the bomb on you, honey. So I've had to tell more than a few dentists over the years that they actually needed a divorce attorney really soon.
Oh, tragic.
Because they were being embezzled by their spouse.
So you would never recommend to be a hands-off captain, but if they did want to empower someone to be a captain, there is a risk with that empowerment for sure. And they should, at a minimum, be verifying some of the details. Otherwise, they're incurring potential risk.
I think it is a valid question when we talk about control systems to ask yourself or to ask me, well, which parts of this require me personally and which parts could be done by somebody else? That articulation calculation that I talked about a few minutes ago, and just for the listeners with a short attention span, that was when we compared daily reporting to monthly reporting. That's a mechanical calculation. That does not require 4 years of a dental school education to do. And if you wanted to offload the articulation calculation to your spouse or your kid who's in college and wants to earn beer money or your bookkeeper, that's fine. What you can't do is give it to a team member, because that's kind of like asking the fox if he'd mind holding the keys to the hen house for an hour while you go to the gym.
Right.
So outsourcing as opposed to delegating. And I think to your question, there are definitely some things that need to be done, can't be done by staff, but also don't require the doctor personally. And if you want to find another outlet for those, by all means. But the overall direction has to come from you. And when this person comes back to you and says something's not right here, then at that point you have to take the reins. Again, that clinical fantasy of the practice owner who is a pure clinician and everything else is run for them, that ship's going to land on the rocks sooner or later.
How many practices have you done an analysis on where you're like, everything's good, right? Like everything's up to snuff, and there's really maybe a small amount of Robin Hooding, but it's nothing like crazy, but there's really no like intentional theft. Like what percent of your assessments come back with like green check marks to the doctor?
About 20%. And
20%.
yeah, um,
Wow.
which is okay. But it also means that 80% of the people who come to us are stolen from. And it means that whatever caused that 20% to call us needs to be pinned down and addressed. So, if somebody calls us and says, yeah, I'm trying to figure out why my adjustments are climbing as a percent of revenue, and I can't think of anything structural that would cause this. And we look and the answer is not embezzlement, then there's another answer somewhere. In other words, when people hire us, they're hiring us to solve a riddle. And one of the answers is embezzlement, but it's not the only answer. And we've certainly, to go back to some things we said a few minutes ago, we've certainly been called in by people who were concerned about embezzlement, and what we found was Robin Hood. Again, still a problem. The financial implications are no different. And that's equally a concern. It just wasn't employee theft. So sometimes the answer isn't embezzlement, it's something else, but whatever causes these symptoms is probably concerning.
So 20% have green checks, 80% of your audits have, a leak, and the leak could be embezzlement, it could be Robin Hood. Is there another category of just like bad operations, just bad systems?
Just to clarify, to me, the Robin Hood is in the 20%. The 80% is theft.
Oh, okay. So Robin Hooding, you'll say, is in the 20% of no bad actors, just bad operation.
It's not embezzlement, but it's a hole in your pocket nonetheless.
So the 80% is intentional embezzlement.
Yes.
Oh my word, that's shocking. 80% of practices you do your assessment with have an issue to be looked into.
Yes.
With intentional theft.
Yeah. And as I say, it could be Robin Hood, it could be crappy systems, it could be staff not understanding what they're supposed to enter. I mean, if we want to be specific, one place that a lot of practices screw up is what's called coordination of benefits. And this is when the patient is covered under two insurance plans. So, I'm going to a practice and I have insurance through my work, and my wife also has insurance through her work, and they both cover. And it is so easy for staff to screw that up and end up over adjusting.
Okay.
Especially if the practice is in network with one of the carriers and out of network with the other, because then you have these two different sets of rules.
Yeah, I can see that.
So that kind of stuff gets screwed up a lot, and that's not embezzlement, and it's not Robin Hood.
So that's just bad operation.
But it still costs the doctor money,
and you'll find it.
Well, we probably will find that. It's not something we specifically look for, but when we don't find embezzlement, then again, we still have the underlying question that prompted the doctor to call us, and we kind of want to answer it.
That's amazing. So David, you've built a team of how many people now over 35 years?
We're 25 people.
25 people, and many or most of them are your you call them investigators, or what is their general title and role?
The majority of our people, they have different job titles, and we actually have 3 levels of investigators. So there's a kind of entry level, and then a more senior level, and then a really senior level of investigator. So we have 3 levels. And they all come from dentistry. We don't hire accountants. We don't hire former law enforcement. It is far easier to take people who understand dentistry and can think the right way, because that's the tougher part to find, and teach them how to be investigators than try to take somebody who is a forensic CPA and teach them about dentistry.
Yeah, they need to understand how to look at a chart and look at practice management software, and all that kind of context is probably super helpful for their investigative work.
That's all true. And it even goes further than that. They need to understand how to talk to doctors.
Yeah, you're right.
And how to have that rapport with them. And they need this smell test of something that's not right.
Uh,
We saw one case where somebody was billing insurance for work that wasn't done. And what we saw was a patient who, over about a 90-day period, had 14 root canals, at least according to their chart.
oh, gosh.
Well, I'm going to make it worse. The patient was 19 years old.
Oh,
So that didn't really happen. I mean, when I showed the doctor the chart, he realized he did not single-handedly invent the concept of quadrant endodontics.
right, right.
So, that, and to any of our people, when they see a chart like that, they're going to say, okay, there's no possible way this is right. I mean,
Yeah.
nobody walks around needing more than a dozen root canals.
Nope.
And then, suddenly show up at the dentist's office and have them all done. Somebody from a non-dental background might not recognize that.
Good point. Good point. Context matters for sure.
It absolutely does. So all of our investigators have worked in dental offices for, typically a decade or more before they come to us.
Hmm.
And then they spend about 1.5 years training with us to the point where they're fully proficient.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's awesome, David. Well, 35 years specializing in dentistry, dental embezzlement. I'm sure you've learned a ton. I'm sure you continue to be surprised, or maybe not. And you've definitely seen many patterns out there to spot things quickly. I'm sure if you had to give any parting advice to a doctor, how would you boil all this down to just give them some nuggets of wisdom that would be most valuable?
Let's go back to the 3 things I said. Print off your reports and look at them. And do that contemporaneously. Do the articulation calculation each month and compare your collections to deposits. In a financial sense, that's the stuff you can do. The thing we haven't talked about that I'll touch on very quickly is also you need to watch the behavior of the people who you work with, because embezzlers will exude certain types of behavior. For example, a lot of thieves, not all of them, but a lot of thieves are reluctant to take a vacation.
They don't want to leave the operation behind.
When they go, they can't control how information flows, and something may get to the doctor that tells the doctor they have a problem. A lot of thieves are very territorial, so they'll be possessive about their duties. They don't want to offload any of their responsibilities to anybody. They don't even want to cross-train anybody to do any part of their responsibilities. And when we talk about division of duties, that's the control freak, the territorial person is the opposite. I mean, they want to agglomerate duties in their hands.
They got to keep their cheat book under control.
Yeah. So behavior is a big part of it. And it's interesting how lunch hour happens in a lot of practices. And what happens is the staff all go in the break room, and the doctor goes in their private office and, closes the door and surfs porn or looks at the stock market or whatever they do. And, then an hour later, they all come back and get together. And what I say to doctors is, maybe once a week or twice a week, eat with your staff. If you haven't done this before, they're going to find this a little weird. So you might have to bribe them with food to sort of get them used to the idea. But the break room tends to be the place where egos kind of get parked at the door. And you'll hear stuff that may cause your antennae to raise, like, somebody trying to buy a house, but they got turned down by 2 mortgage companies, and they're not really sure what they're going to do now. Stuff like that will come out from spending non-clinical, non-patient time with your team. So
Makes sense.
do a bit of that.
Makes perfect sense. Well, David, I'm sure we could keep talking for hours, and I'm sure you've got many stories that you could share, and I appreciate and respect your desire to keep things confidential, not to inspire thieves out there. But with 35 years in the business, I'm sure you've got some good ones. So, but thank you for your time, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. And I'll put some information for doctors to get a hold of you, and the YouTube links, and in the post as well.
Perfect. And I think the audience probably know this, but if you have concerns, I'd love to have a conversation with you. And
Fantastic.
after that, you can decide what you want to do, but make that initial call and let's talk about what's bugging you, and you can work out a plan.
There's an 80% chance you'll find something.
Probably yes.
I love it. Well, thank you, David.
Thank you, Rob.